think?
I think we've only got a few people here. I think we've got a couple of more coming.
Okay.
Maybe wait a couple minutes. Oh, whoops, sorry. I forgot what headphones I was talking into. Let's see, Rabbi. I've got two different recordings going at the same time here. I think we might have one or two more people coming over from the other. Yeah, here comes another couple. Let's wait one more minute and we'll get started.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Are you on mute?
Morning. I'm looking at a couple of empty chairs.
I know.
Not me.
I know.
My chair's full.
Are you on mute?
I'm reminded of the cartoon that I saw years ago of a big lecture hall, and at the front of the lecture hall, on the lecture bema, was a monitor, and the whole lecture hall was filled with monitors. You know, no people either end. Computers talking to computers. We're getting there, I think.
Yeah.
I hope we don't get there. Hi. I'm going to go ahead and get started.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's great.
And yeah, and Jennifer will moderate. And Jennifer, I want to thank you again for taking care of us so nicely and making sure everything runs smoothly. I wish
Absolutely.
I wish all of the webinars and webcasts I've had the pleasure of watching over the last 8 or 9 months would run as smoothly. But I think having somebody like Jennifer, who's so computer savvy and now knows Zoom, can make a second career of giving seminars on how to run Zoom. I think if Beth Yeshurun, you know, if you outgrow Beth Yeshurun, there's a new market for you. All right, today we're going to continue in our look at 4 paths to God. And we've already looked at Orthodoxy and Reform. Today we're going to pick up where we left off last week and talk about conservative Judaism, one of my favorite subjects, obviously. I became a conservative rabbi as a conscious decision. I was born a conservative Jew. I was raised here at Beth Yeshurun. I attended conservative synagogues all through my rabbinical school. Of course, I'm a member of the Rabbinical Assembly and have been a conservative rabbi now for 40 plus years. So clearly I have a connection to conservative Judaism, both theologically, historically, and professionally. And I'm happy to share with you a little bit about it, which may be beyond what most of you know. You may know, of course, what conservative Judaism is. If you've been a lifelong member, you picked up enough of what conservative Judaism is. And you know what it's like when you go from one synagogue to another. You know that from one conservative synagogue to another conservative synagogue, there are differences, but the differences don't change the overall feel and texture. You know if you're walking into a Reformed temple or a conservative synagogue most of the time, although increasingly people tell me that the Reformed synagogue is more traditional and sounds like conservative Judaism, and sometimes there is a closeness between right-wing Reform and left-wing conservative, and between right-wing Orthodox and left-wing conservative. So it's kind of and right-wing conservative, excuse me, left-wing Orthodox and right-wing conservative. So we have a little touching of the movements more than we've had in the past, and I think we're going to continue to see that. And there are some, I would just close with this, there are some in the Jewish demographic and sociological world who believe that within 50 years, we're going to have 2 movements. We're going to have Orthodox and non-Orthodox, essentially. And each one will have its gradations. And who knows? That some of you will be there to see that if it comes true, and most of us won't be. But I think within 50 years, there is reason to believe that there's going to be a shifting and blurring of the lines. Okay. All right. So last week we talked about the Treifa banquet at the Reform Movement's first ordination class of the Hebrew Union College. And HUC was the attempt to establish the first American rabbinical school and to train American rabbis who would speak English, be comfortable as Americans, wouldn't bring the baggage from Europe about how Judaism should be lived or how it must be lived, and would concentrate on areas that would be of more use to a rabbi in the United States than a rabbi for a community that was living in a more traditional European setting. In the Orthodox world, the rabbis at the turn of the 19th century were all from Europe. And even though they had more of a basis on which to preach to their congregations, there was some rebellion against that as well. The attempts were made to have rabbis trained here, but it never worked out for the Orthodoxy until much later. But nonetheless, at the Treifa banquet, there was a group of reformer type rabbis who stood up and walked out. We talked about that last week. And when they walked out, they decided that apparently Isaac Mayer Wise's vision for an American Judaism was simply not going to be acceptable to them and to many of the Jews who lived in the United States, who didn't want to be Orthodox, who wanted some kind of reformed Judaism, but did not want to go the full route that the reformers were apparently opting to go. So what they did was they established what they thought would be the Orthodox rabbinical school that would also build into it some kind of small but meaningful reforms. Some reforms in the prayer book, some reforms in the liturgy, some reforms in the language of prayer. So English would now be allowed into the traditional synagogue service, but it would still be overwhelmingly Hebrew. There would be a rethinking of some of the theology of Judaism. So we would believe in a Messiah, but maybe a more of a messianic era where it would strike the more modern and rational Jew with more meaning. And so they went to work establishing this first seminary. And that seminary was a colossal failure. We'll just sum up several chapters of American Jewish history by simply saying that it was nearly bankrupt. There was a time, by 1901, it was established in 1887, and in those 14 years, rather than grow and prosper and thrive, this new seminary, which took on the name the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was a specific statement, this was not the Hebrew Theological Seminary, like the Hebrew Union College. These were rabbis who were very proud and direct that we are Jewish. We are Jewish in this new growing American world. And there was no masking that this was a religious thing. It wasn't just an identity issue. We're Hebrews. Who called themselves Hebrews? Who called themselves Israelites? Honestly, Reform tried to use every word but Jewish in its institutional titles. And these new Jews said, no. We're Jewish. We're going to be Jewish. We're going to call ourselves Jewish. By 1901, however, this new Jewish Theological Seminary was about to collapse. It had had only one successful positive thing, and that was in the first class of its ordinations, one of the rabbis ordained was the Rabbi Joseph Hertz. Now that name may strike a bell with some of you if you ever picked up the Hertz Chumash.
Right.
Remember the Hertz Chumash we used at Beth Yeshurun for umpteen years? Yeah.
Sure.
Well, the Hertz Chumash
That's
was
the one I use. And I'm always
and
confused.
it was actually used. It was probably the best-selling Chumash in the history of America because it was the only one in English that had an English commentary. So there's no problem ever getting a Chumash, but you couldn't find one in the United States until Joseph Hertz actually compiled his 5-volume Chumash. And it was an attempt not to be used in shuls. It was actually an attempt to be bought by people to use in their homes. the belief widely held in the United States by Orthodox Judaism and the more traditional reformers was that you the only way that you should read the Chumash is in the Hebrew. And that's the reason that we established Hebrew schools very early on. It was the conservative and Orthodox that established Hebrew schools, primarily so that you could read and understand the Chumash, the Torah reading every Shabbat morning. And so there was no translation. The expectation was you were going to actually understand the Chumash as you heard it being chanted from the Bema. As we know, however, that was not the case. Even if you went to Hebrew school, as I did and most of you did, it didn't prepare you to actually sit and listen to the Torah reading and understand everything that was being said. Today, we just assume that we're going to have an English translation and commentary. I mean, that just makes sense today, for if 99% of American Jews are going to understand. However, in this time frame, the late 1800s, the notion of having a book such as that in the synagogue would have been seen as inappropriate, because what it would have said was that it is acceptable to hear the Torah read in another language, or to be studied in another language, or to be learned from by reading a translation as opposed to hearing the actual words of the text. Keeping in mind that many rabbis in the traditional Orthodox world then and now indicate their capacity with the Torah script by drawing on words that are in the Hebrew of the Torah and drawing their Davar Torah, their sermon, from an understanding of specific words and phrases as they are in the Hebrew. And the idea that you would be having a congregation reading the text in English, well, they would miss the play on words that appeared in the Hebrew text. So the idea that Jews would be sitting in the pews following in English, and then the rabbi was going to try to give a sermon on the play of words or a phrase or expression which was untranslatable into English, the same as it was in Hebrew, would cheapen it, according to the feeling of most rabbis at the time. And so the idea that Hertz would create a Chumash, which is the 5 books of Moses. Chumash is from the word Chamesh, which means 5. The book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That he would create such a thing for the synagogue was really not even a possibility. Nobody thought that would be the case, but this was a case of creating a Chumash that you could study at home. It would be yours. You buy it in 5 different volumes. And then when you came to the shul the following Shabbat morning, you would know the text already. You would know the commentary from your reading of the Hertz Chumash. And it was only by popular demand, and primarily from the Orthodox world, and then later the conservative world, that the 5 books were put together as one Chumash, and it was actually allowed to be used in the synagogues themselves. So that took a while, that took a process, but Joseph Hertz was ordained a conservative rabbi, went to England, became one of the first chief rabbis of the British Empire. Not one of the first, take that back, he was part of a line of them, they went back quite a ways, but he became the chief rabbi of the British Empire, which was the chief rabbi of the Orthodox British Empire, if you will, and was held in high regard. Later, by the way, after Hertz passed away, there began a denigration of his work, particularly after the Second World War. And the Yeshiva University in New York, actually, I was told this by people who I believe know, was actually removed from the collection of Hebrew and Bible commentaries. And why do you think it was? Was it because he was ordained a conservative rabbi? No. It was because he made reference in his commentary to non-Jewish authorities. So he says he indicates this in his prologue to the combined 5 books that appeared in synagogues. He drew on the Talmudic reference, consider the truth whatever the source. It's from the Talmud. And he said, in that being the case, if somebody who's not Jewish, even Christian, has a comment to make on this verse, then, and I think it's appropriate and I think it's going to be helpful to understanding of the text, I am putting it in my commentary. And it was this use of non-Jewish sources that ultimately led to the diminution of the Hertz Chumash in the Orthodox world. Didn't impact the conservative or Reform communities, but we all went on ultimately to create our own commentaries to the Chumash. The Reform movement created its own first, then the conservative, then the Orthodox with the Art Scroll, which you'll now see in almost every Orthodox shul. Now, what was it that put the Jewish Theological Seminary back on track? It was a decision made by its leaders, first of all, to initiate a massive fundraising appeal, and they raised what was then considered an absolute fortune, $500,000. That's $500,000 in $1,900, year $1,900, and it was a king's ransom. It was enormous. But what were they going to spend the money on? They were going nowhere. It lacked general loyalty. The Jewish Theological Seminary was not regarded with any great respect, did not have what would be called a distinguished faculty. The synagogues were not in any way included in JTS's curriculum. By that I mean the curriculum did not address itself at all to the emerging movement of non-Reform, non-Orthodox synagogues in a movement that still lacked a name. Okay, there was still no name. It was just synagogues who said we're not Reform, we're not Orthodox, we're something in the middle. So what they decided was they needed to invest in a first-rate scholar who was known for work not only in the synagogue, not only in the study and exegesis of the text itself, but somebody who was worldly in his views and who was widely regarded for non-synagogal accomplishments in the Jewish world. To find such a person was very difficult, but they knew just who they wanted. His name was Solomon Schechter. And Solomon Schechter was an illustrious scholar, not in the United States, but in England. And he was best known because of his discovery of the great Cairo Geniza. Now, you may have heard of the Cairo Geniza, which was uncovered in the late 1800s and early 1900s. A Geniza is found almost in every synagogue. Even Beth Yeshurun had one, or has one. It's not quite as elaborate as certainly the one found in Cairo. But what happens to prayer books and chumashim that grow frail, the pages start falling out, the book is just wearing out? You know that we have a rule that we do not just throw away sacred objects. So we don't throw away a Torah scroll that wears out, or a chumash, or a siddur. We have to find a place to dispose of it. Until modern times, it was customary to put all of these old and worn out objects in what's called a geniza. It would be like a storeroom, and it would be a room that would be locked and kept so that you wouldn't take anything from it, because everything in it was what we would call pasul. It was no longer usable. And so these genizas were typically like under the synagogue. They were in a basement. They were somewhere out of the way. They weren't accessed for any purpose except to take stuff and lay it in there. But what happens when you have a geniza that goes back several hundred years? It's loaded with stuff. And in Cairo, there was a synagogue which had a geniza, and the people who were in the shul, who davened there, they really no longer knew that geniza was there. By that point, we were more accustomed to burying Jewish objects that needed to be disposed of. That's what Beth Yeshurun does. We compile all the stuff that needs to be taken away, no longer can be used, and we bury it in one of our Beth Yeshurun cemeteries. We have a special area. We dig a grave, if you will. We have enough of these objects, put them in there, and you bury them like a person. So Solomon Schechter heard of this Geniza being uncovered. He went, he explored it, um, and from it, he developed an understanding of Jewish history, textual development. Uh, it opened an entire world to him. The documents that were still readable, still accessible, and what they said about the evolution of the Jewish community, not only in Egypt, but North Africa and throughout much of the world. His renown was universal, and he was pushed to come to America and given an extraordinary amount of latitude to create a new rabbinical school built on what was a failing institution, the old Jewish Theological Seminary. They kept the name, but he completely rebuilt the faculty, bringing in, on the basis of his own renown, some of the finest scholars to ever sit in one Jewish institution ever in the world. It became a world-class institution for Jewish higher learning, for the training of rabbis, and ultimately for the training of Jewish educators, cantors, and other Jewish professionals. But its first and primary focus was on rabbis. And if you wanted to study with the finest faculty anywhere in the 1900s, and until I would say 70s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, it would have been very hard to find a single place where you could go and sit and learn with faculty of the quality that assembled at JTS. Now, be mindful that HUC also had a very exceptional faculty for many, many years. But over time, it began spreading that faculty around. So you had one campus in New York, one in Cincinnati, which was the home campus, one in Los Angeles, another in Jerusalem. And so the faculty, although it was excellent, became a bit diluted. It didn't have one place that you could go and find everybody sitting in one big seminary, and every student had the opportunity to study with the same faculty and have the same relationship with faculty members as you did with JTS in New York. So even today, JTS and the Hebrew Union College and the Hebrew University are considered to be the three finest schools for Jewish learning still in the world. And Solomon Schechter was not only the developer of the Jewish Theological Seminary, but he was also given the assignment of creating some theological underpinning that would help this new JTS establish itself as not just a school for those who weren't Reformed and for those who were not Orthodox, but for a school that had some unique focus and ideology. So the word conservative, to define this movement, had been kind of creeping along for some time on an informal basis. And it was the name conservative came to take on two meanings. The first was conservative as opposed to being so reform. And keep in mind that conservative Judaism grew from reform. It didn't grow from Orthodox. And so to say that it was conservative was in relationship to reform. It wasn't a rejection of reform, but it was to say that we're more conservative than the reformers are. Okay, we're not going to get rid of everything. We're not going to just shred Judaism of its core teachings and values. We're going to be more discerning, a little more respectful of what we kept and what we let go. And second of all, conservative in the understanding of the word preserve, like preservative in the sense of not jam and jelly, but to preserve that, to conserve that which was most vital to the perpetuation of Judaism. So to be conservative was to conserve the core values of Judaism, while at the same time acknowledging that parts of Judaism, traditional Judaism, needed some kind of reforming, needed some kind of reconsideration. And so one of the first institutes founded by the Solomon Schechter was the Rabbinical Assembly, which was to create a body for the graduates of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which would be an opportunity for the rabbinical community to stay in touch with one another through its annual conventions, through writing articles and sharing them in a magazine which continued for many, many years until just recently, called Conservative Judaism, which would have been a great name for a magazine for the movement, but was a name that was used by the Rabbinical Assembly for its rabbinical scholarly journal. And you had the rabbis in the Rabbinical Assembly who then created the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which was an attempt to establish parameters for Jewish tradition and practice in this conservative movement. And that is a very important part of what the conservative movement has done. It has taken Jewish law, which was the province of Orthodox Judaism, and said that just because something has been decided in halacha, which is the Hebrew name for Jewish law, halacha from the word lalechet, or holech, which means to walk. Halacha is the way we walk as we go through life and fulfilling our lives as Jews. Halacha dealt with every possible question, whether it was the Shabbat, whether it was Yom Tov, Kashrut, what you did when you woke up in the morning, the very first thing you did, the prayers that you recited. Halacha has got something to say for everything. How you set a Seder plate. What are the foods of Passover? What can you eat? What can't you eat? Halacha, as I said before in one of our earlier sessions, came to fulfill the notion that Judaism is rabbinic Judaism. It is not biblical Judaism. Biblical Judaism would be impossible for us to live in the 21st century. But the rabbis took from the Torah the laws and then interpreted them in a way that enabled Judaism to stay vital and fresh going forward. So as I noted, and I think in another illustration, it tells us to observe Shabbat twice. It doesn't tell us how to observe Shabbat. What does it mean to observe Shabbat? That is all rabbinic understanding of what the Torah meant to say but didn't. Similarly with the laws of Kashrut. It tells us about certain things we can and cannot eat, but it leaves unspoken hundreds of other things. And what about things that are consigned to one category, but later turn out to really not fit in that category? Let's take, for example, some of the shellfish, for example. We've got sturgeon, and we've got, what's the one everybody wants to eat? My mind's gone blank. But we have a couple of fish that have fins and scales, which are requirements of a kosher fish. But what happens when the scales fall off when you take them out of the water? Now you have some fish, they have fins and scales, both of them in the water. You pull the fish out of the water, it still has the fins, of course. It doesn't shed its fins, but it sheds its scales. Some do, some don't. Are they the same? Are they both fish with fins and scales? Well, halacha has said they both have fins and scales. Then, that's it. It says even if they lose them, they still had them. But the Torah, the rabbis learned in the conservative movement, says fins and scales in the water, b'mayim. And that being the case, the rabbis in the conservative movement rule that only if a fish has its fins and scales in the water, it doesn't matter if it loses them when you remove the fish from the sea. All right? So we have a difference of opinion on this. The halacha has changed in other ways too. Orthodox rabbis ruled ultimately that electricity is fire and cannot be used on Shabbat. Conservative rabbis took a look at this question and they asked, well, why is it fire? It's not fire. Fire is defined in the Talmud is very clearly, it has to create ashes, it has to have a spark, it has to have a flame. I mean, that's what fire looks like, right? If I was to show you two logs sitting on a fireplace, but they weren't lit, would you say that's fire? Just because It's going to become burned, but it's not burning. You have to put the fire, you have to create the fire. Electricity doesn't have um, uh, ashes, doesn't create ashes. A light bulb doesn't create ashes. Um, there is no flame. There's no flame in a light bulb. There is a burning, but it's not prohibited per se. Okay. So the conservative movement ruled a number of years ago that electricity is not fire, and therefore electricity can be used on Shabbat. The Orthodox refuse. I should tell you that in almost every instance of a conservative movement decision to be liberal on a topic, there were Orthodox rabbis that were liberal on the same topics when they first were introduced as topics for worthy of consideration. But there is a majority opinion that ultimately ruled one way or the other, and typically the Orthodox decisions were to remain on the traditional side um, rather than to open the doors to allowing reforms in the halacha, even if the Orthodox movement could justify them. Okay, I see a couple of questions here. You'll have to unmute your mic and ask your questions for a couple of minutes. Yeah,
I have a
Ronnie.
question about driving on Shabbat. I thought that was the same thing as fire, creating energy.
Well, the thing about driving on Shabbat is that there is definitely a spark, and there's definitely a fire, the spark plugs, and the things that get the car's energy moving. As long as we use gas as the energy source for our cars, it will never be approved across the board halachically. Now, the conservative movement ruled in the 1950s that it was going to allow an exception. Now, there is a category in Jewish law called a takana. That's when the rabbis essentially say, there's no basis on which I can actually rule on this question according to Jewish law. Okay? But for a need, something that has to be done for the welfare and well-being of the Jewish people, the rabbis have been entrusted with what's called the ability to make a takana. All right? One of the best known takanot is in the 11th to 12th centuries, the takanah, the Rabbeinu Gershon, who ruled that from now on, the Jews of Germany could only have one wife. Now, what basis can any rabbi say that a Jew can only have one wife? I have to tell you, go through the Torah, read it very closely. There's lots of people have more than one wife, and throughout Jewish history, Jewish men often had more than one wife. In parts of the Sephardic world today, especially in the Arabian Peninsula and in North Africa, it's still common for Sephardic Jews to have more than one wife. On what basis can a rabbi say it's prohibited to have more than one wife? Well, Rabbeinu Gershon said it has to be prohibited because we're going to suffer mightily within the non-Jewish world in which we are living, where having only one wife is the law, is the rule. And to have more than one wife is bigamy, and bigamy is punishable. And so he said, we are not going to be able to continue to have more than one wife in the Germanic lands. And this takana, which only existed for Germany, spread among Ashkenazi Jews, which is to say it spread to all the countries around the Germanic lands, and was brought over to America from these Germanic lands. And so that is a case where having the law changed when it couldn't be changed, but had to be changed, was allowed. Same too with this driving takana, which is what it was. It was to say that we can't really argue that there is a halachic basis for this, but here's the problem we have to deal with. The problem is that in the 1950s, we had a mass migration of Jews from the inner cities of America, where in my parents' day, everybody Jewish lived in the same neighborhood, you know? They all went to San Jacinto High School. They all went to the same synagogues. Everything was right there. The idea that you would drive was ridiculous. You wouldn't drive unless you were a goy, you know, unless you were somebody who was just outside the pale. But in the time when the Jewish people in Houston and in New York and Boston go all over the country, after World War II, when hundreds of thousands of Jewish soldiers returned home and got married, They couldn't afford or didn't want to live in these old Jewish neighborhoods. They wanted to live in these new suburban tracts like the Levittowns, where for very little money and the GI Bill, you could buy your own home, have your babies, and their synagogues were being created. Okay, not to drive back into the city to go to shul. They were building them out in the suburbs, and the conservative movement was afraid that if we continued to say that you shouldn't drive on Shabbat, that people, Jews, young Jews, old Jews, would continue to drive everywhere but the shul. They needed the Jewish people to come to shul because we needed to have communities that flourished in the suburbs of America. And so this permission to drive on Shabbat, if you read the whole Takana, you will see that it only allows you to drive to shul and back. It is not a permission to drive anywhere else for any other purpose. Now we know that that's not the way it is followed in reality today. But that is the intent of the Takana. It was to save American Jewry by keeping it connected to the shuls, and anything else was not permitted. Now I will add one other Takana, one other question that is going to be considered on this question of driving, and that is, can you drive a Tesla on Shabbat? All right. Now, I became aware of this question because of Rabbi Sarah Fort and her husband, Rabbi Ariel Schulklapper at Beth Yeshurun, bought a Tesla, and I saw them driving it. And I know that she and he weren't driving when they first came to Beth Yeshurun. So I said, oh, I figured, well, I guess they started driving following the permission of our movement in the 1950s to drive on Shabbat. So I went over to her and I said, oh, I see you're driving your car on Shabbat. I probably shouldn't have said anything, frankly, but you know, it's my nature. So I said what I did, and she said, oh, no, we're driving only this Tesla because it's 100%. It's not a mixed, a hybrid. It is 100% battery run. It has no electrical components. It has no alternator belt or alternator. It has no battery. It has a battery, but it has no spark plugs. It's strictly a battery-driven object, and so it's completely okay. You know, there's no problem at all with driving. So I did a little research on it myself, and I see that it's a question that's coming up. It's coming up. It's probably going to make its way to the Rabbinical Assembly Committee on Law and Standards, my guess. It may take just a little while longer because they're very slow. Is it going to make its way to any Orthodox rabbinical institution? I doubt it, because their response is most likely going to be that it looks like driving. Okay, it has the function of driving, and therefore it can't be allowed. That's the same reason that they have not permitted the use of digital cameras. Okay, again, the reason for the prohibition of cameras is because you change the quality of the film. You create an imprint, which you can see in the negative, and that's considered writing. But you don't have any of that when it comes to a digital camera. There's nothing to see. It's totally electronic, and nothing is being actually written that you can consider writing. Okay, so some of the conservative movement have permitted digital cameras, but the Orthodox have not. So the law committee has done a number of things to help make swordfish, by the way, was the other fish I was thinking of. But the law committee has been trying to moderate some of the strictness of halacha and at the same time be true to its essential core teachings. Okay. Now, what is the basis on which conservative Judaism has flourished? Its essential decision to reach out to the Russian immigrant community in the early 1900s was a stroke of genius. if you will. There was already a large Jewish community here in the United States from the mid 1800s. And these were the Jews who went on to work side by side with Isaac Mayer Wise in the establishment of the Reform movement. But the Reform movement and the Reformed Jews typically, not always, but typically, did not want to associate with the Russian Jews who were coming to the United States in the late 1890s and early 1900s and through 1920. These were Jews who fled Russia, Poland, because of actions taken by the Tsar, resulting in a wave, massive wave of interminable pogroms. And you all know the story because everybody here has seen Fiddler on the Roof. You know what it was like for the Jews there. They lived in their own cloistered areas. They got along with people, but there was an awful lot of anti-Semitism, and the Tsar played on it. And finally, the Jews of Anatevka immigrate west. Now, where do they go? Some of them made it to Western Europe, which was more hospitable, but still, many of them, a tremendous number of them, a few million of them, made it to the United States. And they all ended up, of course, as all Jews and immigrants did, in New York. When they got to New York, they discovered that they were not particularly welcomed by the Jewish community that was there, who looked upon these Jews from Russia as bedraggled, as shtetl-like, Yiddish-speaking, long beards. They were just not what Reformed Jews were and what German Jews were. German Jews were living uptown, and they'd made it their way uptown, and they were living in nice homes, and they were dressed like gentry. They were in these Reformed temples, which were beautiful to behold and very polite and dignified and decorous services. You could bring your non-Jewish partners and friends into your Reformed temple, and they would go, this is gorgeous, it's beautiful, all in English, no cantor shrine, no rabbi giving an old sermon about, well, Moshe says to Chaim, no, none of that, it was all very edifying. And then you get these Jews from Russia who walk around, and it's like they lifted themselves out from the shtetl, and they moved the shtetl into New York. So there wasn't a lot of love lost. And of course, like all immigrants, they started in the Lower East Side. So you had the uptown Jews and the downtown Jews. And a number of books were written about the two different communities and the conflicts between them. You had parallel organizations that were created by the German Jews. And then you had parallel organizations created for the Russian Jews, by the Russian Jews, okay? Which is how we get the American Jewish Committee and the American Jewish Congress, which for many years did the exact same thing. With the American Jewish Committee was all German Jews, the American Jewish Congress was all Russian Jews. And Reform Judaism was German Jews, and conservative Judaism decided to latch on to all of these hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews who needed a spiritual place, but also had their own ideas of what they wanted. They wanted to be authentically Jewish, these Russian Jews, but they didn't want to recreate exactly what they had in the shtetl. They wanted something that would help them integrate into the new America in which they were now living. They wanted a new kind of Judaism that would take hold of, keep hold of those things that were most essential and valuable, but also bring these Jews into the new American modern world. And that's exactly what conservative Judaism was and wanted to become even more. It called for conservative rabbis to be now American trained, of course, and to speak English, and to make accommodations for these Russian Jews as they tried to assimilate into America and into the larger Jewish community. And so, taking that tack, the conservative movement established itself as the home for Russian Jews, and that persisted well through the 20th century. Even when I began my career back in 1980, and I was a student at various conservative synagogues in the 1970s, there was still a disparity between the demographics between Reform synagogues and conservative synagogues. Um, and I think it's less so today, but it may still be so in many communities, especially in New York. There's generally more wealth in the Reform communities and less wealth in the conservative communities. And some of this goes back to the Jews who came into each movement at their foundations, and the kind of institutions they created, and how one community continues to turn over the leadership within the same community going forward. And so today we see less of that, but 40, 50, 60 years ago, it was still not uncommon that if you talk to conservative Jews, they very often came from Russia. Their ancestors came from Russia and Poland and Eastern Europe. And very often when you speak to Reform Jews, their ancestors came more from Germany, France, and England. A lot of that's gone. The federation system, I should point out, because I always see Lee Wunsch's face as I'm looking at this, the federation system for decades was the province of conservative Jews, conservative Jewish leadership. And that was largely because the German Jews who were already here already had the institutions that they needed. They already had the wealth that they needed to serve their own needs. But there was a need for communal funds to help the tremendous number of Russian Jews who came to this country. And ultimately, they became more involved in the leadership of the Federation movement and remained so for many, many years. Today, I don't believe there's any distinction made between Reform and conservative and Orthodox leadership, maybe more so Reform and conservative. There's more Orthodox involvement in the Federation world, but most of the leadership still remains from within the conservative and Reform congregations. I don't think there's any meaningful distinction today as there was perhaps when I first began my career back in the 70s and 80s. Lee, do you have any comment on that?
I think you're right on spot. I would just add that in the 50s and 60s, when the federations became very Israel focused, it also lended itself to have more leadership from the conservative movement, because the Reform movement still had cold feet around the level of their and commitment of their support for Israel.
Right. That's a good point. Definitely. All right. I want to spend the next 10 minutes looking at Reconstructionist Judaism to close off. The course is called Four Paths to One God. I know I'm giving short shrift to Reconstructionist Judaism. Reconstructionist Judaism is very small. Many of you don't even know what it is, may not even know if we have a Reconstructionist synagogue in Houston. We do. It's actually a chavurah. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. There are, in the entire United States and Canada, about 100 Reconstructionist congregations and chavurot. A chavurah, you may know from its use in other contexts, especially in the conservative movement back in the 70s and 80s. There was a movement to create chavurot, which is like small groups of members, if you will, who would meet and become friends within their chavurah, within their group. They'd study together, they would learn together, they would celebrate holidays together. A chavurah is just a group. In religious terms, like the Reconstructionists use it, these are like fellowships in which they do prayer, they do all the things that a synagogue would do, but they only do it within their smaller group. There may not be enough people committed to the Reconstructionist movement philosophically, theologically in any given community, but there's a minion of them who are, and maybe more, and they create a chavurah, a Reconstructionist chavurah, and I believe that's what we have here in Houston is a Reconstructionist chavurah. Some synagogues have a Reconstructionist synagogue as such. Um, there's not a lot of them, but those that are there, they are there, and they are functioning. Reconstructionist Judaism has had difficulty creating its own niche because much of what Reconstructionist Judaism has given has aligned itself to be has been given and absorbed by the other movements already. Okay, so let me give you an example. It's the only movement that was really established by a person or in honor of a person. That's Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan was a professor um, uh, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he developed a whole set of ideas that for Judaism to survive in the United States, especially, it had to transcend its religious roots. It had to be more than a religion. It had to be more of a place where people came to be with other Jews. You had to understand Judaism, he said, as more of a civilization, if you will, which is to say it encompassed every quality of your life, any part of your life that is committed to the Jewish standard or principle or history or culture or music or theater or study, that brought you within the fold. You didn't have to be an observant halachic Jew. You didn't have to define your Judaism by how many times you went to shul. You defined your Judaism by your connection to the civilization of the Jewish people. And he envisioned the synagogue being more than just a place where you walked in the door and there was the shul. He envisioned you walked in the door and there's the shul. There's also a lounge, and there's also a assembly hall, and there's also classrooms, and there's also arts and crafts, and there's also anything that is Jewish would be there in the synagogue. Okay, now does that sound familiar? I mean, it sounds like any Reform synagogue you've ever been to. It sounds like any conservative synagogue you've ever been to. It even sounds like many Orthodox synagogues you've been to. This notion of being Jewish transcends your religiousness and says that I'm just part of the Jewish people, and whatever I do in the synagogue with Jewish people that's Jewish, that's okay. That's who I am. And that's what the synagogue comes to nurture and foster. And because that core idea has been embraced by all of American Judaism and Western Judaism, it's been hard for Reconstructionist Judaism to say, well, that's what we stand for. That we gave you that. We know we gave you that. Okay. And we're grateful. A professor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Mordechai Kaplan, came up with that idea. He instilled it in his conservative rabbinical students, who in turn, when they were creating their post-war conservative synagogues, embraced that idea. A second idea that Mordechai Kaplan had was this notion of God. Okay, he struggled with the idea of God being a supernatural figure, if you will. And he understood God in a broader sense. God is the force that saves, which is a very difficult concept to understand. That there is some force in the universe, he doesn't know what it is, that ultimately brings you salvation and redemption. Now you can say, well, that's God, or you can say it isn't God. You can say, I'm not sure what it is. But from Kaplan's point of view, what it meant was that you don't have to embrace the notion of God as God in the sense that God watches over you, God decides everything for you, that God blesses you, God curses you, that there is some persona of some divine quality. You can believe that there is a force in the universe, of whatever force it is, that ultimately provides you with the life you possess and the salvation which we all seek. It's so nondescript, you can make it mean anything. But the truth of the matter is, it's what most American Jews believe, okay? In the sense that if you really believe 100% that there is a God in heaven who decides every action you take, who judges you every moment of your life, who sees and hears your every thought, you would act very differently. Would you not? If you really believe that, you would act very differently. When an Orthodox Jew says, I can't do this because it is forbidden, he is saying, I believe that. I believe that there is a God in heaven who is watching me, who is hearing my inner thoughts, who knows who I am at my very core in a way that even I don't know. And this God has said it is forbidden. And if I do what he has forbidden, I will be punished. If I do what is right in God's eyes, I will be redeemed, I will be blessed, and I will be saved. And that's the distinguishing line between orthodoxy, which does believe this and acts as if it believes it, and the non-orthodox, who may believe some elements of it, but by their very behavior suggest that they don't believe it the same way that Orthodox Jews do. Okay? Because if we all believed it, if we all believed that God really controls our life, our destiny, and everything that happens in our life, then we would all be keeping the strictest kosher possible. We would never missing an observance of Shabbat in any way, shape, or form. We would be doing everything according to the halacha in order to make sure that our destiny pleased God. So yes, we embrace some aspects of it, maybe many aspects of it. Maybe sometimes we do and sometimes we don't. You know? But that is a distinguishing line between orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy. And Mordecai Kaplan simply wrote it down. He just acknowledged what he felt was a reality among non-Orthodox Jews. And so that is one of the essential teachings of Reconstructionist Judaism, but it is also a teaching, not a teaching so much as it is a belief in value that is held by non-Orthodox Jews everywhere. So those unique qualities that make a Reconstructionist synagogue, it turns out, are not so unique anymore and have not been for a long time. And so therefore, it's been very hard for Reconstructionist Judaism to prosper and flourish in the United States and Canada, and it almost is not to be found abroad. There is a Reconstructionist synagogue in Israel, in Jerusalem, which I've attended or did some years ago, but the movement has really been more a tribute movement to Mordecai Kaplan, who, by the way, didn't found the movement. It was founded by disciples of him who felt it should be a separate movement. For Mordecai Kaplan, he was a conservative Jew, and he was happy with his teachings being taken by his students into their conservative synagogues, which they did, and wasn't necessarily looking to create a movement. But as he got older and people were afraid that his ideas might die, some of his followers established the Reconstructionist movement to reconstruct Judaism, and they built it on his teachings. I'm not sure Kaplan was enthusiastic about it, but he did support these Reconstructionist synagogues toward the end of his life. Okay, anybody have a last question? Some questions? Yes.
I have,
Yes, Rabbi.
Wait,
Yeah. Kerners.
Hello?
Yes, you can go first. Go on.
Yeah, Rabbi, why aren't there conservative synagogues throughout Europe?
Why aren't there more conservative synagogues throughout Europe? There are some conservative synagogues in Europe, but they are very few in number. Conservative Judaism has been defined as an American religious movement. It may surprise you, but as we saw from the story, it was really founded here. It went on to create the Jewish Theological Seminary here, trains American rabbis here. Now, conservative Judaism does have a seminary in Europe. It has one in South America, in Argentina. It has a seminary in Israel. And they do turn out conservative, or what's called Masorti rabbis. You may have heard the term Masorti. Masorti means, it'll go off in a second, I'm sorry. I turned off my phone, but I've also got other iPads and other things that pick up the sounds. Okay, so, and there are conservative Masorti synagogues all over the world, but they've never really prospered the same way. And that's because in other countries of the world, they all have Orthodox synagogue communities, which tend to dominate, going back historically to the way they were funded and supported until the last century. And as far as Europeans are concerned, and South Americans, but mostly Europeans and Israelis, they understand that there's Orthodox and then there's the other stuff. They don't really see a distinction between Reform and conservative. As far as Israeli Jews are concerned, you're Orthodox or you're not. And if you're not, then they're all the same. It's been very difficult and probably a political mistake for conservative Judaism in Israel and Reform Judaism in Israel to be separate movements fighting for pretty much the same thing, but diluting their political power. Because Israelis really don't see the difference. And that's true in much of Europe as well. So it's just been very hard for American-based movements, and especially conservative Judaism, to get its sea legs in these other countries. Just we are an import, and imports don't always do as well as the native born. So Reform has done a little better because it's such a sharp distinction between Orthodoxy. There's a real choice, right? Conservative is we're like Orthodox, and we're also kind of like Reform. That works in the American mentality, but it hasn't really made sense to vast numbers of Europeans, Israelis, and other places.
Well,
Joan,
having said that,
yeah.
Having said that, it's a shame that many Israelis are not at all observant.
Many Israelis are not observant because they only see the alternative to be Orthodox, and the Orthodoxy of Israel is very strict. We have in the United States shades of Orthodoxy. So for example, if you go to Young Israel here in Houston, or you go to United Orthodox synagogues, they are different in terms of their Orthodoxy. Okay? And there are people who go to UOS, for example, would be very uncomfortable at Young Israel, and some at Young Israel would be very uncomfortable at UOS. That's because one is modern Orthodox and one is very Orthodox, if you will. The Young Israel is on one end of the spectrum, and modern Orthodox is on the other. And they even, I wouldn't say fight among themselves, but they have strong differences of opinion, locally and globally. I would tell you, modern Orthodoxy is losing the game. Not here necessarily. I think UOS is still the largest Orthodox synagogue, but on a global basis, modern Orthodoxy is not doing as well as the more Orthodox, and that is a reaction to the strength of very strong Orthodoxy in Israel. For a long time, we American Jews have thought that we're the ones who give Israel what it needs. In Israel, the Orthodox community, which is empowered by the government, you understand, is empowered by every government that's served in Israel since 1948, has empowered Orthodoxy as the only official Judaism, and therefore it has tremendous power and influence on Orthodox Jewish communities around the world in a way that conservative and Reform do not, in Israel or beyond. It's very difficult for us to take root anywhere. It's been very hard. Yes. Joan, you had your hand up. Unmute yourself, Joan.
Okay, now?
Yeah.
Okay. Many years ago, I had some old tefillin and prayer books and stuff, and I scattered around the city. No one would take them, but United Orthodox. So I packed it up and I took it to United Orthodox, and the girl who took it said, I am delighted to take this. I'm building a new house and I'm burying every bit of old Judaism under the house because it's going to make it blessed. Have you heard about this?
Yes, I've heard about that. Right. There's two things you do in a house under very Orthodox law. One of them is that you bury um, uh, used religious articles, books in a corner under your house. And another is that you leave a portion of one wall unfinished. Okay, it can be a brick size, it can be just something is left unfinished. They don't paint it, they don't put the chapel, I don't know, whatever, they leave it like it is, okay? Um, and both of these are considered important things that you do. The one of the books and the religious artifacts is that your house is built on a foundation of Torah. You know, it's like the Torah is in the very heart of the home. And the leaving unfinished is to remind you that your Jewish life is incomplete until the Mashiach comes and the second temple is restored.
I never heard that before.
Okay, so your life is incomplete. Just like you smash a glass at a wedding, you know, it's to remind you, happy, you're happy? Oh, you smash the glass at the very end. Just remind you that you're not as happy as you will be when the Mashiach comes and the temple is restored. Okay, because until then you can't be completely happy. It's always that shattered glass, and shattered glass is never a good thing. Nobody says, "Hey, let's have some fun. Let's go break glass." No, shattered glass is a sad thing. You get upset when glass shatters, and the particles everywhere. You step on it, you cut. It's miserable. Nobody wants to shatter a glass. You do it to remind you, wake up. You know, wake up. You think you're having a wonderful time. We have a wonderful time, but don't forget, we're not really where we need to be yet. And some would say that the leaving the unfinished corner of the home undone is also a reminder that you will live there, but you're not finishing this house because you're not going to live here forever. You're ready to go. Okay, you haven't finished that house. You're ready to go when the Mashiach comes and the second temple is rebuilt. Okay, so you think it's your house for the next rest of your life? No, no, no. You're going to leave this little. You're not going to finish that because no, I'm not. I'm not staying here forever. I'm leaving. Okay, one day I'm leaving. Okay, I'm going back home. Okay, yes, Ronnie.
Where does the chapel fit into the spectrum of conservative Judaism?
The J.B. Greenfield Chapel at Congregation Beth Yeshurun is very different from the rest of the synagogue. The synagogue as a whole is committed to an egalitarian observance of Judaism. And we use the current prayer book of the conservative movement. The J.B. Greenfield Chapel was part of Congregation Bethel. Adath Yeshurun. And I believe it was Adath Yeshurun. That was the Orthodox one of the two, wasn't it? I think it was. I think Bethel was the conservative. Pretty sure. Anyway, in the merger agreement between the two synagogues, it was agreed that the larger synagogue would retain a traditional service for the combined within the combined congregation, and that's in the synagogue's bylaws. And so, any attempt to change the J.B. Greenfield Chapel would have to go for a vote of the congregation to amend the Constitution. Now, the reality is that there are still conservative synagogues, primarily, almost exclusively in the Northeast, that are still non-egalitarian and pretty much follow what you see happening in the J.B. Greenfield Chapel. I would say that number is very small, and many of those synagogues, when the next rabbi comes, that's the typical pattern. When the next rabbi comes, that will change it to the mainstream conservative egalitarianism. But there are still some synagogues who've had the same rabbi for many years, and they have what they like, and they like what they have. Okay, and I was a rabbi on Long Island, New York, for 4 years when I was first ordained, and still studying at JTS. And I would visit synagogues, and of course, I knew all the rabbis, conservative rabbis, and I would meet a number of these rabbis who believed strongly in the non-egalitarianism of their synagogue, or did not believe strongly in it, and were preparing for a short stay or to do what they could to ultimately change it. Now, here in Houston at our J.B. Greenfield Chapel, the reality is that even though it is defined in the Beth Yeshurun bylaws as a traditional, with a capital T, synagogue, there have been changes already. And so, for example, they do count women in the minyan. That never went to the congregation for a vote. The J.B. Greenfield Chapel just decided. It just happened. It wasn't publicized. You never got a letter from the J.B. Greenfield Chapel or the rabbis. It was like one day, you know, I remember this has been several years ago when I was still rabbi. I remember being there on a Saturday afternoon for Mincha Mariv, and we were short two men. And Benny Katz was sort of the gabbai of the shul then. So this goes back probably 8 or 9 years. And all of a sudden, Benny Katz announced, we have a minyan. Well, I looked around, there was 8 men. And I said, I only see 8 men. He said, you're not counting right. I said, I'm counting right. He says, no. He says, I know how to count. Okay, so then we went on with the 10. There were 2 women. I noticed it again several times later, not just with Benny. So then it became that at a board meeting maybe 3 years ago, somebody point blank asked the chair of the ritual committee, are women being counted in the J.B. Greenfield Chapel? And he said yes. So it was one of these things that they decided not to make a big thing of it. And as it turned out, nobody did make a big thing of it. So as long as nobody made a big thing of it, then it just kept on going, you know? And will women be allowed to come up to the Torah and read from, get an aliyah to the Torah? Well, you know, yes and no. If you come in on a Shabbat morning and say, I want an aliyah, and you're a woman, well, women don't come up to the Torah. However, come to the synagogue chapel service on Simchat Torah, everybody gets an aliyah to the Torah, including every woman gets an aliyah to the Torah, okay? And the chapel leadership is sitting right there. Nobody says, hey, she can't go up there. For the last several months, we had a chapel service that was every evening, but then we had some occasional, we had every evening, and we had some women who came up and led the service. Okay, so the chapel leadership said, well, it's not officially a chapel service. Well, it was everything but officially. Okay, and let's just put it this way: we have a few people in the chapel for whom this is still important, and we have a vast majority of people who come to the chapel who will probably be ultimately involved in a chapel service that will be egalitarian. I really don't know if that will happen in my lifetime. Honestly, these things are very slow developing. If it stays as it is, and the congregation seems comfortable with it by and large, or indifferent, it won't change. If there's pressure from outside, maybe there will be. I don't know. Bob, you come to the chapel regularly, always have for quite some years. You've seen some of these changes unfold, but you have any thoughts about it, Bob? Unmute yourself. No, don't want to? Okay. But anyway, that explains our J.B. Greenfield Chapel and what it is. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, folks, it's been a pleasure being with you and having you together with me these past Sundays. And I look forward to seeing you again in Shul. Hopefully, we'll all be able to be in Shul again.
Rabbi, it's
soon,
Paul.
right?
Rabbi,
I
can
hope
you,
so.
Rabbi, can you hear me?
Is that who's that?
Paul,
Paul, I don't even see. Oh, there you are, Paul. I'm sorry. You're kind of
right,
faint.
I was slow, I was slow on the trigger when you asked. Anybody else have a comment on that? I
Yeah.
think it's just, I think it's so, you know, I think it's hypocritical that we can count women in that minyan in order to achieve a minyan, but yet on the other hand, they can't get up on the beam and daven and lead the minyan.
Exactly, Paul, I agree.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing. I don't want to go into it any longer because I think Jennifer's giving me the proverbial hook.
You're lucky.
Understandably, I'm running really long today. It's our last time together. Look, the chapel has made all kinds of exceptions. Rabbi Fort, when she goes into the chapel, you know, she is able to speak from the bema, and the other women don't. She does, and I think that's only right. In fact, I think she should have all rights, frankly. But you know, the chapel has its rules, and the synagogue has respected them. And it will be, I think, a slow process until we reach a point where we have a little blending of traditions, a little more in the chapel than we do now. But you know what? That's going to be an internal decision. And anything I say only complicates things rather than helps. So, folks, thank you again. Thank you, Jennifer.
Rabbi,
And
Thank you,
everybody,
Rabbi.
stay warm
Great
this summer.
blessings.
Thank you,
Listen,
Rabbi.
thank
listen,
you.
most of all, stay safe. Stay safe, okay? It's not over yet. Okay? Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.